Sometimes you just need a comfort project, something you know will bring you joy. Not too complicated, but still challenging in the right places, enough to help you grow a little, but not too much. After 2 very demanding projects that took weeks to complete, countless hours of preparation and a lot of brain work, I'm definitely in need of one. Maybe it's also the time of the year, the changing leaves, the stormy days, that makes me crave a cozy autumn-themed project. And what could be more fitting than a mushroom sleeve dress? It's one of my all-time favorite designs. It captures the essence of autumn perfectly, and it's just challenging enough to promise some cozy hours spent sewing. Another reason I chose this project is because it's important to remember. Not every project has to be grander, prettier, or more impressive than the last. We often dream big, and while that's wonderful, it can also lead to exhaustion and sometimes disappointment. So I promised myself to take a step back every now and then, to create something simpler, just for the joy of making. To reconnect with the craft itself and not lose myself in the ever-growing expectations that come with sharing your art. Now that we're settling into those cozy creative vibes, I want to take a minute to talk about something that may help with that, and it's today's sponsor, Craftsy. Craftsy is an online learning community with thousands of creative classes, from sewing and quilting to embroidery, knitting and more. It's such a lovely place to find inspiration when the days are getting cooler and you just want to slow down with a hot drink and something creative. If you're in the mood for a relaxing hand project, you might love Startup Project, Modern Hand Embroidery by Jessica Long. It's perfect for unwinding in the evenings with some tea and soft music while learning new stitches and creating beautiful floral or animal patterns. Or for something peaceful and painterly, there's Landscape Watercolor on toned paper, which walks you through painting calm, layered autumn landscapes in gentle tones. If that sounds like your kind of fall project, now is the perfect time to try it. The first 1,000 people to click the link below will get a full year of Craftsy Premium for just $1.49. This offer is only for new members, so don't wait too long. Thanks to Craftsy for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to the project. The first time I made the mushroom sleeve dress was in 2021, after watching a YouTube video by Rachel Maxey about mushroom sleeves, which instantly inspired me to make a matching dress. This means the pattern is quite old, so we definitely need to make a mock-up to see how the fit is now, 4 years later. The first mock-up is just the old pattern traced and sewn. I used a cotton muslin and left the center front open so that I could just pin it closed. For a first fitting, this is definitely enough and saves adding some kind of closure. So the first mock-up is done, and I would say the overall fit is okay. The size in general fits well. It's not too short or too long, it's not too wide or too small, but there are a few things I want to change. First of all, it is a bit too revealing for my taste. I think the way it sat last time was a bit more curved at the top, and so I want to bring that back a little bit. And also, if I move to the side, you can clearly see that the bust point doesn't really match. It should be a bit smaller down here and a bit wider up here, so that it doesn't make this weird wrinkle there. This is, I think, a major thing that will change the look of the front a lot. Otherwise, I'm really happy. I really like the look of the back. I think it's very pretty. I also like the length, keeping in mind that there will be a waistband added underneath of the bodice, so it gets a little bit longer, which is fine because right now it is technically a little bit too short, or at least not where my waist sits. But with the waistband added, I think this will match better. So I think the next thing I will do is to take apart this mock-up and just reuse the whole bag because I really like it, and I don't think I will change anything about it. I think I would just redo the 2 front panels, like this one and this one, so that I don't have to redo the whole mock-up, just those 2 pieces. I also feel like it's a bit too tight under the arm, but there is still the whole 1 centimeter seam allowance all around. So I think I would take away just a tiny bit. And then once it's sewn with the sleeves in, I'll cut in the seam allowance anyway, so it won't be noticeable. So those are the few small changes I want to do now. And I think this will work out pretty fast. Now it's time to refine the pattern. Since I wanted to change only the 2 front panels, I cut the mock-up apart and then drew the changes into the old pattern. Interestingly, I made very similar changes sometime earlier, just not enough as it seems. And since the back could be reused, I only had to trace the front panels onto the muslin, add the seam allowance and then add those 2 panels into the mock-up. Once I tried on the mock-up, I really liked the fit, only the top shifted slightly, which was a result of the deep neckline. To give a bit more stability at that weak point, I added some soft boning directly at the seam. I'm really happy with the look of the mock-up. I like how clean the lines look, I like how wrinkle-free it is. So the next step would be to trace the pattern and prepare it so that I can make the actual dress out of it, because now it's just a sheet, but I need pattern pieces to continue. But first of all, we have to make the pattern for the sleeves, because they're going to be a huge part of the dress, and I want to make sure that they're the perfect size, the perfect fluffiness, the perfect width, the perfect length. Since we now have such a great base for the bodice, I can just continue with making a mock-up for the sleeve. I couldn't find the actual pattern that I drafted with the original dress. I'm pretty sure I reused this sleeve pattern a lot for the other versions I made from this dress. And so I'll take a closer look into my other patterns if I can find it. Otherwise, we have to draft it. But even if we find it, we still have to adjust it a little bit, I'm pretty sure. I found a pattern that was quite similar to what I had in mind for the sleeves, so I traced it and altered it a little bit to fit into the arm side of the bodice pattern. Then I also traced it onto the muslin to try the sleeve on as well. I still had to gather the top and bottom, so I added a big gathering stitch on both the sides and added a twill tape as a cuff to secure the gathering there. The top is then sewn into the bodice and I could try on the complete mock-up. I really liked the overall shape, especially the puffiness at the top, but I wanted to take a little bit of the volume out and shorten the sleeves slightly. So I drew all the changes into the pattern, but didn't see the need for another sleeve mock-up. Now that the pattern is set, I have to refine it a little. Whenever you tweak a pattern, it can happen that the different pieces don't add up lengthwise, so checking this is always the last step in creating a pattern. For this, I make sure to lay 2 adjacent pattern pieces next to each other and draw in the discrepancy at the waist. This way I work my way around the pattern from seam to seam until I'm sure all the lengths match up. Once I'm happy, I make sure to cut out the pattern pieces as precisely as possible, since just minutes ago it was about adding or taking away millimeters. Changing this now would be really sad. The pattern is done and it's time for the fashion fabric. In today's case, we'll be working with a cotton velvet I've had in my stash for a long time. This is also the reason why it has some marks from where it was stored wrong or places I maybe bumped into without noticing at that time. So the first step is to determine where we can cut out our pattern pieces. Since velvet looks different in every direction, this was also a bit more limited. Once I was happy with the layout, I could start tracing the pattern. This can be tricky on velvet, since the nap makes it shift around a lot. Using a pen that doesn't need a lot of pressure helps a lot, also because you can otherwise see each marking on the outside, which, as you can see, happened here. But since I'm sewing on those lines anyway, that's okay. Each pattern piece got a 1 cm seam allowance added, only the center back got 2 cm. After that, I cut out all the pattern pieces. I also prepared the 2 sleeves, 3 skirt panels, as well as the 2 cuffs and a waistband. After all other pieces were cut out, I reused the traced pattern pieces to create the lining pattern from them. Sometimes I like to trace it completely new, but when it's as simple as this, I like to make it this way. All front and all back pieces are joined together at the top to create the facing, while the bottom is cut off to make the lining pattern from it. This creates an easy lining pattern that matches the outside perfectly. In the end, I also added all 3 back panels together to create one big back lining panel. The facing pieces are then traced from the velvet the same way as the outer pieces were before. Since I now had all of the velvet pieces cut out, I decided to overlock the edges to counteract the nightmare of velvet fluff a little bit. Otherwise, maybe half an hour later, the whole atelier would have been covered in tiny fluffy velvet pieces. The overlock machine is the newest addition to the atelier. It's almost as old as my sewing machine, and we spent a few months taking it apart completely, cleaning it, switching out old parts and reassembling it to make it work again. I filmed the whole process for Patreon, so if you're curious about that, the videos will go live over the next weeks. This is actually the first project I'm using the machine for, so after changing the threads to match the velvet, I did a little test swatch. I'm still so confused how it works so smoothly, since in my memory working with those machines was always a hassle to get them to cooperate with the fabric. And since this, miraculously, wasn't the case this time, I could cover all the raw edges with the overlock. Once that was taken care of, I could cut out the lining. For this project, I chose to go with a contrasting lining. I thought it would be fun to use a creamy white to match the stem of a toadstool. The lining then gets prepped by ironing it carefully with a lot of steam. This way the fabric shrinks before cutting and not after, which would lead to a lining that's too small. First of all, I ripped the 2 panels for the skirt lining. Since the fabric I'm using has a plain weave, I can just rip it at the right measurement and get a straight edge this way. Then I cut all the other lining pieces, starting with the biggest ones, the sleeves. For the lining bodice, I added a soft interfacing to the fabric so that the red velvet wouldn't show through too much. On this, I then traced the lining pieces for the bodice, added a seam allowance of 1 cm and cut everything out. The next day, I started to actually sew the dress. Well, not really the dress. I started to assemble the lining, simply because I still had the white thread in the sewing machine from sewing the mock-up, and I thought, why not start with a matching color? So I began by sewing the front panels together, pressing each seam carefully. Then I added my label to the waistband, making sure it was centered and straight before carefully sewing it on. After assembling the whole waistband, all the main parts were sewn and it was time to add the velvet facing. This is something I usually struggle a lot with. Somehow the combination of this lining and velvet is really slippery and I always dread this step. I actually draft my lining pattern with that in mind by avoiding adding complicated seams or sharp corners. This time, however, it went really well and so the lining bodice was completed quite fast. This meant I could move on to the lining skirt. I joined the two panels together at the center front with a French seam and then gathered the top so that I could add it to the waistband. Here I made sure to divide all the little pleats evenly before sewing both pieces together. Next, I added the lining top to the skirt and pressed everything. Then I worked on the back. The dress will have a zipper added later, so I made sure to sew the bottom together with a small stitch while using a bigger one on the top so that I could remove it after pressing the seam open. Once all skirt seams were closed, I sewed a simple hem, folding the bottom edge about 0.5 centimeter and then again 1 centimeter to create an even seam all around. After pressing the hem, I checked with the measuring tape how precise it turned out, and I was really happy that overall it matched up great. To finish the lining dress, I worked a little on the opening for the zipper. I sometimes like to add a little folded square at the bottom. This will later cover the end of the zipper and creates a very clean look without too much work. And with that, the lining dress was done and I could start working on the outer dress. Every time I sew something made from velvet, I get a lot of questions how I get the seams done when everything shifts. And the way that works best for me is to just sew it without any pinning. I usually start with the test seam to see in which direction the fabric shifts, because the advantage is that when you cut velvet, you have to cut it in the same direction, because otherwise it would look different with the different directions of the fabric. So you can assume that when your test seam shifts into one direction, this will likely happen with all of the other pieces you're sewing, especially when it's about bodice pieces that will usually go from top to bottom and not from left to right, for example. So I sew a test seam, and with this particular piece, it happened that the upper piece shifted a lot towards the bottom and towards the left. So it shifted down and left. This meant that for every seam I sewed, I pulled with my right hand at the bottom piece and with my left hand made sure that both pattern pieces didn't quite align when laying on top of each other, but that the top piece laid a few millimeters, maybe 2 or 3, to the left. So I laid the top piece a little bit shifted to this side on the bottom piece and pulled at the bottom piece. And this way I just sewed. I didn't pin anything, I just sewed the two pieces together. And for me, this works really well. It created smooth seams that are on the marking Of course, there are where it shifted 1 millimeter, but overall this creates very good seams. And for me, this is the easiest way to sew. I also try to pin everything in place very thoroughly with a lot of pins, but this always led to markings of the pins on the velvet. And this way you don't have any pins that would damage the fabric, which is a huge bonus. And this is the first step to get smooth seams in velvet, because when the seam itself isn't sewn smoothly, it's very difficult, at least for me, to iron it nice. So whenever I have a seam like this is the best starting point for the ironing and getting the seams as smooth as I want them to be. And now the next step is to iron this seam so that it gets as flat as this one. With a clean seam as the base, I always like to press each seam like this. First, I press down on the seam allowance really hard. This way I flatten out the fabric there and it won't bulk as much inside the dress. Then I put a bit of velvet on the ironing board and lay the seam flat on top. When the seam is curved, I do the same on my little ironing pillow. Sometimes I even like to pin the edges in place to make sure the seam is stretched. Then I add another fabric in between the seam allowance and the fashion fabric. This prevents the edge of the seam allowance from pressing through the fabric. And then I carefully iron the seam, in this case with lots of steam and very little pressure. While the seam fully cools, I usually sew the next one. This method works really well for me, but there are so many other ways to do it, so try and see whatever works best for you. With the bodice done, I worked on the skirt. Like with the lining, I started with the waistband and then moved on to the skirt. The skirt panels were sewn together the same way as the bodice and now needed to be gathered. For this, I marked every 1.5 centimeters along the whole length and then added 2 gathering threads by hand. Since the fabric is so thick and I needed large and dense pleats to gather it all into the small waistband, I couldn't use folds or gather it by machine. So now it's a weird version of cartridge pleats, I think. Before gathering, I used safety pins to mark each half so that it would be easier to pin equal sections to the waistband. On the waistband, I marked the same number of sections and then added both pieces together. After pulling the gathering threads, I sewed the skirt to the waistband, making sure to carefully align each pleat before sewing over it. This created an even, tightly pleated skirt with lots of volume. Now it's time for the most important part of the dress, the sleeves. To create the look of toadstools, I wanted to add a lot of pearls to the sleeves, creating a kind of gradient from top to bottom. To make sure everything is lined the way I wanted, I created some guidelines with basting thread. Then I got out the pearls I wanted to use. I had 3 different sizes. To make sure I had the same amount for each sleeve, I split each size in half. That way I wouldn't run out of pearls when working on the second sleeve because I'd already put enough aside. I started with the biggest pearls and arranged them at the bottom of the sleeve along the first basted line. Once I was happy with one side, I wrote down how many pearls I used and continued with the second sleeve. The difficulty with those sleeves is that I want them to look similar but not the same, because I think when the inspiration is something organic like the mushroom tops, then having both sides of the sleeves completely mirrored takes away a little bit from that. And so I want the sleeves to look similar but not the same, which actually is the most complicated way to do it, because you can't just copy a pattern on both sides and then trace it. So the way I do it is to work on both sleeves at the same time and do them in sections. So in this case, for example, I started with the big pearls and just took 50 of them and then made the first line using 25 and then made the second line doing another 25. And this is something I note and do the same way on the other sleeve without trying to match the pattern, but just the overall spacing. This means I'll have the same amount of pearls in the same space, but not at the same places. And this results in having the sleeve similar and feeling almost identical without actually looking identical. And this way I'll work my way up to all the different pearls. And this is what we're going to do now. I already started with the big pearls and now I can move on to the second size, and this way I hope we'll get a nice result in the end. Adding the second size worked the same way as with the first one. Again, I took 50 pearls and added them to the sleeves, filling out the spaces between the big ones and spreading out at the top and bottom. Every time I added another batch, I carefully noted it and did the same on the second sleeve. I also like to check once in a while how the sleeve looks when added to the dress. In between, I always like to prepare some needles with threads so that once I'm adding the pearls, I don't have to stop to rethread the needle. So the sleeves are slowly coming together. We're now at 200 pearls on each one, I think. It's 50 of the big ones and 155 of the smaller ones. And I think I'll now start with the smallest ones and spread them in between and also move them up a little bit. And maybe afterwards I need to add a few bigger ones in between as well, but I think now is the time to really spread out the small ones and to see how the gradient will look with them. The smallest batch of pearls is the most fun, because here the gradient really comes together and everything looks so much smoother. "600 pearls later, I'm done with putting them on the sleeves. And I really like how it looks. Once I've sewn the sleeves and added the cuff, I will have to add a few more pearls, especially here, for example, where I left some room so I would be able to close the sleeves. So I'm not completely done with that step, but I think 600 pearls is a good number. I started at 10 and now it's almost 5. So roughly 7 hours with a few breaks in between, which I think is really nice and really fast. I think putting it on this embroidery frame thing helped a lot with getting some speed, and also dividing it into those smaller sections of pearls also helped a lot, because I didn't have to think so much. I could just add a few without thinking too much and then switching, adding the next ones. In between I could always like take a break, walk around a little bit, drink a little bit. And so this felt very natural and had a nice speed that I really liked. So I think that's also a reason why it worked so well. And now the next step is to actually make sleeves out of that. While I was sewing the pearls on, I thought about adding some kind of tulle as a backing to the sleeves, because the pearls are quite heavy and I want the sleeve to have a little bit of volume. And I remember that when I made the dress the first time, the sleeves were kind of collapsing. And so I think I'll back them with some kind of black tulle I think I still have from the last project to give the fashion fabric a bit more sturdiness. The last step is to carefully remove the basting thread, which also helps a lot with making the gradient stand out. Now the sleeves can be sewn. The velvet sleeve is pinned on the tulle base and then the tulle is cut out using it as a guide. The gathering stitch at the top and bottom makes sure nothing shifts. Then the cuff is prepared and, like on the skirt before, divided into equal parts so that the sleeve can be pinned to it. Then all of the extra fabric is gathered and both pieces are sewn together. Then I got out the lining sleeves and the whole process is done on the other side of the cuff as well. Both pieces are pinned together in equal parts. The sleeve is gathered carefully and then sewn to the cuff. I like to make the sleeves this way because with the cuff flat, it's a lot easier to gather both sleeves evenly. And now that this is done, the seam of the sleeve can be closed. Then the whole sleeve is turned inside out and we can see for the first time what it really looks like. Once the sleeves were done, the last piece I needed to prepare was the belt. Just a long strip of velvet sewn together and then turned inside out. Now all the different parts of the dress are done. The bodice, the skirt attached to the waistband, the two sleeves already with the lining sleeve inside, the lining dress and the belt. With only the zipper missing, these are all the pieces ready to be assembled. I started by adding the bodice to the skirt. Since the skirt was already attached to the waistband, this was really easy, just sewing two pieces of the same length together. Then I added the zipper. This was the trickiest part and I wanted to get it done without the big sleeves in the way. First I closed the center back, making sure all seam lines matched. Then I added the zipper, first with a big stitch to secure it in place and after checking that everything matched with a smaller stitch. Adding a zipper to velvet can be very tricky because everything shifts so much, but I was really happy with the outcome this time. Then I added the sleeves. They were pinned in place at the bottom and carefully gathered at the top. Once the whole sleeve fitted into the arm's eye, I sewed it in on both sides. And then it was time to add the lining dress. This is my least favorite step because there's just so much fabric. But after carefully pinning both necklines together, I could sew them. Then the whole dress was turned inside out to reveal the clean neckline for the first time. After that, there was just a lot of hand sewing to be done. First, I worked on the sleeves. To make the top really puff out, I pushed the gathered seam allowance into the sleeve. To secure it in place, the facing is pushed flat against it. This is then sewn together by hand, making sure the stitches are directly on the seam between sleeve and strap. This way the seams are invisible from the outside, but the seam allowance stays in place. Then the open arm's eye is closed. The lining is pinned in place and then finished by sewing the lining sleeve on top of it by hand. Finally, I worked on the hem. Here I try to catch one thread of the skirt before securing it to the folded fabric. This way nothing is visible from the outside, but the hem is very secure. And finally, I sewed the lining to the zipper to close the dress completely and have it look as neat from the inside as it does from the outside.
So this is the final dress. I had so much fun sewing it and making it. It was a really nice time to make it again, and it was exactly the project I needed. Not only could I just sew a little bit and have fun, but it was also the perfect autumn-themed project in my opinion. What do you think? Do you think I captured the autumn vibe with this dress? I hope you liked today's video. If you did, feel free to like it and subscribe to my channel. This always helps a lot. Also, don't forget to check out Craftsy. The link is in the description. And now, see you next time.